Mary Curie, you probably remember that name, she was the person who, in a giant metal cauldron, started refining uranium in her laboratory in Poland, and made what was called the first autoradiograph. And she basically, on black and white film, stuck a piece of uranium on black and white film and made an image. Well, basically, this is my attempt at the same kind of thing, except it's in color. So basically what I did is I gathered together about 20 different chunks of uranium. Jay and I would travel around the U.S. to uranium mines with a Geiger counter, and we'd snatch these blocks, and I really appreciate the Bureau of Land Management's lax. They're not very watchful of the uranium mines, right? So you can just walk in there and grab stuff. So anyway, so Jay and I grabbed pieces of uranium, brought it back to the studio, placed it on ready-load packs, plastic ready-load packs for 4x5 film, left it on there for a month and a half, and that's the image that came out. There's been no color manipulation or anything. That's exactly the color that comes out. And incidentally, this particular blue color is the color of radioactivity. If there is a radioactive accident, for example, as there were at Los Alamos, what happens when you bring two highly volatile pieces of uranium together into a critical mass, when it goes critical, it gives off a huge blue glow in the room. If that blue glow falls on you, you're dead. So, and I remember when I was 12 years old, my father took me to the Naval Research Lab down along the Potomac River, and they had one of the earlier nuclear reactors, okay? And so I remember as a 12-year-old climbing up on top of the reactor. I climbed up these little metal steps and got up on the top, and I stood up on the top of it, and I looked down between my legs, and there's this giant blue glow all down there below me, right? And so that impressed the hell out of me. So basically, that's one of the reasons that I endeavored to do what I did, and I survived this one. This is another piece of uranium placed on, this is probably the most perfect portrait of a piece of stone, a piece of uranium that was placed just on film. It almost looks like the piece of rock that it's, you know, an image of. But again, it's the radioactivity making the image, nothing else. No light involved. A small farmhouse just outside of Minneapolis. A place called Waukesha. Walked into this farmhouse with my Geiger counter. This guy had something I wanted. We walked into the front door, and the whole downstairs was filled with Winnie the Pooh objects. This person collected for 30 years. So the whole downstairs was filled with Winnie the Pooh. And so we walked upstairs, and the whole upstairs was filled with uranium-tipped weapons. Over the bed, nice cases, cold drawers, hundreds of these things, all highly radioactive, surrounding his bedroom. And in the daughter's room. And he collected these things for 30 years. These projectiles are called depleted uranium projectiles. They're used by military services around the world, basically to penetrate tanks. Uranium has the wonderful ability, if you want to call it wonderful, to burn. It's pyrophoric, and it's extremely heavy. So you have a very heavy fire-producing object being fired at a tank. So they use these a lot. So I basically, this is right before 9/11, we mailed these back and forth to each other through the U.S. mail. And I made a special crate out of styrofoam and lined with lead, and then we put these in there. He'd mail me one, I'd photograph it, then take a piece of 4x5 film and lay it on the bullet, right? I'd lay it on the bullet. It would take about 2 weeks to make this image. Again, it hasn't been altered in any way. This is transparency film. And so basically, this is a radiograph taken from the bullet. This is another one. This is called a pencil dart. And it's another same kind of penetrator. It's a tank penetrator. And again, we mail these back and forth until basically 9/11. I mean, it probably does stop. Okay, so the Carnegie Institution here in Washington, D.C. It's a nice leafy neighborhood. And the scientists at the Carnegie Institution wanted to start splitting atoms. But they didn't think it would be a real popular idea with the neighbors. So they had to build a big facility. So they built this giant facility, and they decided to call the Atomic Physics Observatory. Observatories are benign things. You can and open them up and look at the stars, so it didn't make a wrinkle in the neighborhood. So they built this building, and they built this particle accelerator in that building. And this accelerator basically generates about 3 million volts here with this sphere, channels that voltage down this tube into a basement room located underneath, and there are these little tiny wires. Actually, these are real silk threads that were used by the scientists, and they controlled this, and they controlled the ion gun and all this stuff using silk. And this was the first major electrostatic particle accelerator. This is the idea, okay? So you have this, all that stuff up here, the belt, the accelerator beam comes down here, goes through the floor, through a magnet, down here where the scientist is just hanging around with no radioactive protection at all. And the beam comes down here, goes into a cloud chamber right here, where he has a camera and he's taking a picture of the activity in the cloud chamber. And this was a picture that was put out by Westinghouse in order to sell more of these large particle accelerators. This is the same unit that is used in oncology departments to treat cancer as well. So I walk into remember that underneath that particle accelerator went through the floor into a room underneath. And I went into that room about 7 years ago. I went into that room. I don't go into any rooms like this without a Geiger counter. And so I went into the room with a Geiger counter, and my Geiger counter starts going crazy, right? Now this is a fairly large concrete room, and it's filled with 2x4s and lawnmowers, and groundskeeping equipment piled all over the place. There's a little wooden cabinet on the wall, right? And the closer I got to it, the more my Geiger counter started going off, right? And so I open up the doors, and the Geiger counter goes crazy, right? And so I'm looking at all the uranium, fluoride. All these things are highly, in addition to being radioactive, they're highly explosive. So anyway, so all these little objects here, if you read this carefully, this is polonium-210. Remember polonium-210? That has a significant effect on human beings when they eat it. So basically, this is highly toxic stuff. This apparently was removed fairly quickly after we made this discovery, and then I continued on with my project. I didn't use any of this, but this is actually historic chemicals, right? And I was just actually at the physics, I was taken on a tour of the physics department at the Smithsonian Institution, and they have hundreds of bottles just like these of historic chemicals that were used for historic experiments, all in cabinets with radioactive symbols on them and everything. And who knows, that could be where those things are now, but I just thought it was interesting that they were just sort of like hanging out there like they were in 1935. So you can see the dates on these. So these are the drawings that I got from the library at the Carnegie, and took these photographs with my little camera when I was in the library. And from these photographs and those drawings, I wanted to recreate that experiment, fissioning uranium, and I wanted to recreate the machine. That first machine that you saw was ignominiously sawed up by the Smithsonian and now is in storage out someplace in Maryland and probably never to be seen again. So in order for me to use this as part of my thing, I had to rebuild it. So basically, using these photographs, I started working. And so these are the internal tubes of a particle accelerator. These are called potential rings. This is a Pyrex glass cylinder. This is the base of a 5 million volt Van de Graaff generator that was fabricated. This is a sphere I fabricated in my studio down where we live now is on an island in the Chesapeake Bay. Basically, I needed a place with a moat. And because I didn't want people with pitchforks coming to my gate. So basically, I fabricated all of this and built it the Carnegie went through several iterations of the machine. First, they built this machine outside, which is the one that I emulated. And then they realized it's kind of tough to split atoms outdoors. And besides that, your neighbors can get bummed out if they find out. So we have to put a building around it. So they put a building around it. And so basically, my machine configuration is roughly like this. Roughly